Disney, Rupert Murdoch, Fox News, Bill Maher, and former US government officials. Seems like a pretty random list, right? Well, they have one surprising thing in common, and that's Vice. And no, I'm not talking about porn, gambling, or drugs. I'm talking about the multimedia empire that's leading the mainstream media machine in producing edgy reporting behind a hipster, cooler-than-thou facade. Vice, the brand, is built around an anti-establishment vibe that's always feeling the pulse on the fringe. So how did the brand go from producing a niche magazine in Canada focused on street style and sex to being a bona fide multimedia empire that includes a popular website, growing digital footprint, and partnerships with major corporations? Well, the shift happened gradually. $200 million from Disney here, $70 million from Rupert Murdoch's 21st Century Fox, making the media mogul 10% owner there. Then there's a talk show sponsored by Bank of America and another sponsored and hosted by career Islamophobe Bill Maher. Not to mention giving world-famous puppet master George Soros, who funds coups in favor of NATO around the world, his own segment. Now the list goes on, and perhaps it's too long to mention all here, but Vice Media expanded by quietly embracing the very corporate and government entities that hold the least credibility with its own liberal audience. And while positioning itself as a ballsy, no-holds-barred alternative to the mainstream media, Vice has actually become the mainstream media. Now, Vice hasn't just sold itself out to the neocon agenda, it's also normalized that agenda among its audience through its growing digital platform. Now, sure, Vice still bucks the government line on issues like marijuana legalization and does stories on what people should wear to get laid, but on stories of foreign policy, Vice's tone tends to align with Washington's maneuverings, including the re-emergence of Cold War narratives, pushing Russia phobia and justifying NATO's aggressive posturing towards Russia in Ukraine and Syria. And as Robbie Martin notes in part 3 of his documentary series, A Very Heavy Agenda, Vice achieved what Fox News terrorism fear-mongering could never achieve: fear of Islamic terrorism among young American liberals, to justify, of course, those so-called humanitarian bombs. Now, Vice News has become a tool of soft propaganda. Its reporters frequently cite outlets like Voice of America and Voice of Asia broadcasters, which fall under the umbrella of the U.S. state-sponsored Broadcasting Board of Governors that pushes U.S. interests abroad. Now, Vice, it turns out, is an ideal vehicle for delivering Cold War interventionist messages to a generation that knows better than to trust the mainstream media or the government. The problem is that generation doesn't seem to realize that Vice is the mainstream media and it is pushing government narratives. Now, Robbie Martin is here to talk more about how Vice gets away with towing the line of the establishment and how it's helping shape a new breed of pro-war young liberals. Check it out.
So when Vice lost Gavin McInnes, Vice apparently was completely taken over by their marketing side. So Shane Smith was their marketing guy, and he took over the content and started running the magazine completely himself. And from there, it sort of evolved into this thing called Vice News, where HBO had an actual Vice News program that was produced in part by the extremely Islamophobic Bill Maher. So that's was, I think, the start of it. But what you started seeing very quickly with Vice News is a lot of their coverage of really important issues happening around the world, like in Venezuela, in Syria, in Iraq, especially in Ukraine, was very slanted noticeably towards a sort of pro-Western narrative, and in some cases actually a pro-US government narrative, but at times actually being a very subtle form of that. I believe that the bias was very clear, and I think it all came to a head when they got this incredible access to ISIS before most of the world had even heard of them, and they actually got to do like a ride-along. Now, these were apparently stringer camera people who weren't officially working for Vice, but time and time again, Vice gets this incredible access to battlefields in Syria and Iraq. They have a whole episode where they're essentially promoting the work of the FSA, which are the CIA-funded Syria rebels, as if they're doing good and noble work. So there's a lot of very questionable content that they put out like that.
Right. And speaking of the pro war establishment, you talk about Voice of America and Voice of Asia, broadcasters which fall under the umbrella of the U.S. state sponsored Broadcasting Board of Governors as new partners with Vice. These are obviously soft propaganda tools used to push a U.S. agenda abroad. How is Vice normalizing that neoconservative agenda of promoting U.S. imperialism and aggression through these tools?
Well, the Broadcasting Board of Governors is a body that now encapsulates all of the U.S. state-funded media outlets across the world, that we spend almost $1 billion a year on this program to beam pro-American messages into mostly focusing on hostile areas or hot spots in the world that could tip either way. They could tip in America's favor. Some of these nations can tip in Russia's favor. But what Vice is doing with the BBG is you see all these Vice stories, mostly in print, which have actual citations or information contained in them from the BBG. And keep in mind that Radio Free Liberty, Radio Europe, was actually funded by the CIA at one point, and it was under the guise of it was under the umbrella of the Office of Information, the U.S. propaganda arm. Now it's trying to present itself as more legit. So you'll see in the Vice print articles many references. I found over 40 over a 3-year period where they actually would insert something from Radio Free Europe. But what was really striking is they never mentioned when they did this that it was a U.S. state-funded outlet. However, whenever they mention RT or Sputnik or anything having to do with any other country's state-funded media model, they'll make that part of the story. They'll be like, this is the Kremlin state media-funded RT or whatever. They just casually are dropping U.S.-funded state propaganda in tons of articles. And when I actually asked authors of Vice articles that had this content in them, some of them didn't even know it was there. An editorial decision was made over their head to actually insert it into their article after they had written it. So that speaks to a troubling pattern that's not just a random, author for Vice deciding to put this in on themselves.
Right, and I'm really glad that you talked about that and pointed that out, because we have some pretty big names that are, invested big in Vice. Bank of America, Rupert Murdoch, Disney, Fox News, former U.S. government officials, and even pro-war and what I like to call career Islamophobe Bill Maher. These are just some of the examples of the people and corporate entities most distrusted by young anti-establishment liberals, yet they've basically teamed up with Vice in one way or the other. But how much longer do you think Vice can maintain this illusion? I mean, what happened to young people's bullshit monitors that Vice co-founder Shane Smith has famously mentioned as a reason why an outlet like Vice is so important?
Well, I think what happened to people's bullshit monitors is Vice snuck through them because Vice, in a lot of ways, is superficially this liberal, hip, cutting edge, sex positive, drug positive. It has all of the elements that young people would glom onto. But what happened was once it passed through that membrane, it's firing on all cylinders, in my opinion, of pro-US and pro-Western narratives on these really crucial foreign policy issues happening all over the world. Another great example is the Ukraine Russian roulette special. They went for over 100 episodes and somehow omitted that the US government admitted to spending $5 billion to foster regime change in Ukraine. Now, they covered every single corrupt thing under the sun involving Russia. They combed over every single detail involving that, but yet they didn't mention even the most obvious, blatant ways the U.S. was involved in flipping the government of Ukraine.
Right, there's obviously a major rise in Russia-phobia, Putin-phobia, and you point out that actually hipster propaganda like Vice are leading the way in pushing that. How has Vice, if you can give me a very specific example, shaped the narrative about Ukraine and Russia?
Well, it started very subtle. So I think that they were one of the outlets that put quite a lot of attention on things like Pussy Riot's arrest or the Russian gay propaganda law. Vice was one of the biggest outlets constantly trying to push these subjects into headlines on a daily basis. And keep in mind, they were also doing this around the same time that other millennial outlets. Now, this is really important to remember, is these are millennial style outlets like BuzzFeed and the Daily Beast, were very much on board with this anti-Russian narrative that all sort of started around the same time. But I believe what Vice was doing was more insidious because they didn't have neocons writing articles for them. They didn't have neocons going on their news channel. It was all done under all these new faces, all these young adventure tourist style, kids fresh out of college who are barely being paid anything. So in a lot of ways, it actually, I believe, played on the gullibility of young people and people who don't have much of a political conviction, especially about restarting the Cold War, which is something that the CIA and the BBG were exploiting back in the 1960s. They wanted to eliminate what they called Cold War neutrality, specifically among intellectual liberals. And in this case, I believe that the US State Department is trying to reach liberal millennials to try to feed this propaganda, and Vice is just one of the means in which they do this.
Right, and obviously, the crisis in Syria is also influencing young people's perspective about, Muslims and Islam. How has Vice helped influence young liberals' view of Islam to justify U.S. bombs in the Middle East and in Africa?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think it's tricky to answer because on one hand, their style of newsmaking, especially their ISIS specials, is very much like a fly on the wall. There's barely any commentary, but the commentary is done through the editing and the scary, music and all that kind of things. The editorial point of view is there, but I would almost draw a parallel about black on black crime. This whole concept that the right wing, is hysterical about. Imagine if, to address the black plight in the United States, Vice made a special showing only black on black crime. That to me is what they've done with the ISIS special. They show it with no context. They make these people seem like total barbaric monsters who are basically like serial killers running rampant in Iraq and Syria with virtually no context of how the U.S. Created the situation in the first place, how there are a lot of regular citizens who feel trapped by ISIS and feel like that they have to work with them, but instead they don't show that gray area, the distinction, that some of these people in ISIS might actually just be regular people who are caught up in a terrible situation. But then you have this special where they show rebels, pro-U.S. rebels in Iraq and Syria, and they're portrayed great, like they're heroes. There's no talk about, U.S.-funded rebels beheading a Palestinian child or anything like that, of course. It's just, why isn't the U.S. funding these people more? It's actually trying to advocate for more CIA funding of rebels, which is quite bizarre for a millennial hip news network, I think.
And of course, none of this could really be even possible without somebody within the company driving Vice into this direction. You previously mentioned Vice's co-founder, Shane Smith, who really kind of gives off this badass vibe. He's really the face behind Vice. Give me some examples of how Shane Smith and his ties to the neocons drove Vice into this direction.
I think Shane Smith is the key to a lot of this. To me, he seems very gullible, politically speaking. He seems like he is a marketing guy. He did get very rich very quickly. And I believe all of those factors enable, and this may be too gracious towards him, is a vulnerability inside his company where, because they switched to a marketing-driven model where they actually will have now Bank of America and other corporations producing content for them, literally, I think to someone like Shane Smith, it's not that big of a deal to have the U.S. State Department producing content for him, or to be suggesting content, or the White House to be suggesting content for him, like as we saw in the Obama prison special that Vice did, which happened right after Alyssa Mastromonaco, a White House chief of staff member, one of Obama's top advisors, became COO at Vice. So once we started seeing that jump, we just started seeing actual Vice specials that had all this White House coordination. And then, of course, Shane Smith wants his viewers to see him hugging Joe Biden and laughing it up with Joe Biden and being enamored of Joe Biden. For some reason, Shane Smith thinks that's something to be proud of as a journalist. But of course, he's out as he's not a journalist, and none of the people at Vice are journalists. They're just young people who are trying to figure out the world. I mean, that's the whole mindset that he's trying to put out, is that they're not real journalists. Well, actually, you are working in journalism, and you're a very, very bad journalist who's doing things that, in my mind, should be seen as not only unethical, but also inappropriate for a journalist to be doing. But then there's a lot of other troubling details, like Rupert Murdoch owns 10% of Vice, and Shane Smith doesn't seem to have a problem with that. Disney now owns a very large chunk of Vice. So on one hand, we have them evolving into a very generic mainstream news model, but on the other hand, we do have interesting, weird things that Vice is involved in that no other news network is focusing on during this sort of growth phase. One of them is Shane Smith admitted to airing a free block of programming in Eastern Europe in 2014 during sort of the Euromaidan uprising. I'm not sure if he understands how volatile something like that would be to do. I think that he's just found himself in this very good opportunistic position where he can make a lot of money and somehow get away with being a pro-US government propagandist without being called out on it by his audience, which so far hasn't really happened.
Well, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to have you on. Such a great conversation. Robbie Martin, filmmaker and director of A Very Heavy Agenda. Everyone should check it out.
Thank you, Manar.